This is my true story. I raised my son alone after his mother passed away. I gave him everything I had, my time, my savings, my health, just so he could have a better life. I never asked for much in return, just respect, just a little care. But one winter night in Ohio, my own son did something no parent deserves. He took my wheelchair, shut the door, and left me outside till morning. I survived that night, but I didn't forget it. What I did next changed both our lives forever. Before that, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so my story can reach more people. It was one of those Ohio evenings where the wind feels heavier than usual, sharp enough to sting your face. I had spent the day on the porch, wrapped in an old blanket, watching the sunset fade behind the trees. My legs had been getting weaker for months, and the wheelchair was the only way I could move from the porch to the kitchen and back. My son had promised to help me after dinner, to bring me inside once he finished his work calls. I believed him. I always did. But as the hours went by, the lights in the house stayed on, and no one came. I called his name a few times, softly at first, then louder. No answer. I figured he might have gone out back, maybe to grab something from the garage. I waited, but the minutes stretched long. The wind picked up, and I could hear the old wooden boards of the porch creak beneath me. When I tried to roll forward, the wheels didn't move. That's when I saw it. The wheelchair wasn't where I'd left it. He'd taken it earlier to move something heavy from the garage and never brought it back. It sat across the yard, leaned against the wall, too far for me to reach. At first, I thought he'd come back for me. Maybe he forgot for a few minutes. I waited, staring at the door, expecting it to open any second. It never did. The house stayed quiet, except for the faint sound of his television through the window. The temperature kept dropping. I tried to pull the blanket tighter around me, but the cold found its way in through every small gap. The air smelled like frost and wet wood. I could see my breath in the dim porch light. As the hours passed, my hands started to stiffen. My fingers wouldn't bend easily. I kept telling myself to stay calm, that he'd remember soon. But every car that passed on the highway sounded like a reminder that no one was coming. The neighbors' lights started going out one by one, their windows glowing faintly before turning black. I sat there, alone, listening to the ticking clock from inside the house that I couldn't reach. Around midnight, the blanket stopped helping. My feet felt like stone. My face burned from the cold, then went numb. I tried knocking on the door with my cane, but the sound was swallowed by the wind. I looked at that wheelchair again, just a few feet away but unreachable. The thought crossed my mind that maybe this was it. Maybe this was how it ended, not from sickness, not from age, but from being forgotten by the very person I raised. Hours crawled by. My body trembled uncontrollably, not from fear, but from exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that sinks into your bones. I could see the first light of dawn slowly creeping through the trees. Birds began to chirp faintly, and the frost that had settled on my hands started to melt. The door finally opened, and he stepped out, half asleep, holding his coffee. For a second he looked surprised, then almost amused. He said something I couldn't even process. My body was too cold, my mind too tired. He grabbed the wheelchair casually, pushed it toward me, and said something about how I should have called. I couldn't respond. My throat was too dry, my lips too cracked. I just looked at him, the same boy I once carried in my arms, the one who used to fall asleep on my shoulder, and realized something I never wanted to admit. The person standing in front of me wasn't my son anymore. He was a stranger wearing my bloodline. That morning, as the sun rose over the frost-covered yard, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't shout, I wouldn't cry, I wouldn't beg for respect again. I'd get up, heal, and take back what he thought he owned, not with anger, but with power. The kind of power that doesn't yell, it signs papers. That night didn't end when the sun came up. The cold had already done its work. My hands were stiff, my back ached, and my legs felt like they didn't belong to me anymore. I could feel the dampness of dew soaking through the blanket, the kind of chill that seeps into your skin and stays there. I watched my son walk back inside like nothing had happened. The sound of the door shutting echoed louder than the morning birds. I sat there for a long time, staring at the steps, trying to move but too weak to push myself. The wheelchair sat beside me now, but it felt useless. Not because it was broken, but because the trust that once sat between us was. The neighborhood started to wake up. I could hear car doors slamming, engines starting, kids waiting for the school bus. Nobody noticed the old man on the porch. Nobody asked why he hadn't moved all night. The world kept spinning while I sat still, frozen between disbelief and exhaustion. The frost that had built up on my sleeve sparkled in the sunlight like glass shards. My fingers had turned a pale blue, and when I tried to flex them, they barely moved. My breath came out shallow, like every inhale took effort I didn't have. At some point, I managed to grab the armrest of the chair and drag myself into it. Every inch felt like a mile. My muscles screamed, my lungs burned. When I finally sat back in the seat, it wasn't relief I felt. It was clarity. The kind that comes when you realize there's nothing left to say, nothing left to prove. That night had stripped away any illusion I had left about family, about care, about loyalty. The truth was simple. When people stop seeing your worth, you stop reminding them. I wheeled myself to the door and paused. I could see him through the window, sitting at the kitchen counter, scrolling on his phone like it was just another morning. A cup of coffee in one hand, that same careless expression on his face. I thought about all the nights I used to sit in that same spot helping him with homework, all the mornings I packed lunches and told him to be kind to others. Every memory of love turned into a question of how we got here, how a father becomes invisible in the home he built. I sat outside for another hour, letting the sunlight hit my face. My body started to warm, but my heart stayed cold. The neighbors across the street waved when they saw me, thinking I was just enjoying the morning air. I waved back and forced a smile. They didn't need to know. This was between me and the son who had forgotten the meaning of love. When I finally went inside, the air smelled like coffee and toast. He glanced up for a second, nodded, and went back to his phone. No guilt, no apology, just silence. I moved past him slowly, my wheels creaking against the floor. Every sound felt heavy. I went to my room, shut the door, and sat in the quiet. I didn't cry. I just stared at the wall until the minutes blurred into hours. That afternoon, when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see weakness. I saw endurance. I saw a man who had survived worse and could survive this too. That night was no longer a tragedy. It was a turning point. I realized something important. People who forget where they came from need a reminder of who built the road they walk on. And I was going to give him that reminder, not through words or anger, but through the one language he understood best, power. By evening, I was already making a list, not of what he'd done wrong, but of what I still owned, what I could still control, what could still be taken back. My hands shook as I wrote, but not from the cold this time. It was from determination. I had spent my life building things from nothing. This time, I was going to rebuild my dignity. I didn't say a word to him that morning. There was nothing left to say. I sat in my room, wrapped in a blanket, trying to stop my hands from shaking. Not from cold anymore, but from what I had realized. The kind of pain I felt that day wasn't loud. It was quiet, deep, and steady. It didn't hit all at once. It settled in slowly, like a bruise spreading under the skin. Every sound in the house felt different. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, even the ticking of the old wall clock, they all reminded me of how empty the space between us had become. He walked around the house like nothing had happened. Coffee in the morning, work calls at noon, music playing at night. Not once did he look at me and see what he had done. I realized then that cruelty doesn't always come from hate. It comes from neglect, from the belief that someone's too small to matter anymore. I used to think the worst thing in life was being alone. I was wrong. The worst thing is being surrounded by people who treat you like you already are. That day, I stayed in my chair by the window and watched him leave for work. His truck rumbled down the driveway, loud and careless, like him. I thought about every time I used to carry him to bed when he was a boy, too sick to walk on his own. How I stayed up through the night just to make sure his fever broke. How I worked double shifts so he could go to college and build a life he wouldn't have to struggle through like I did. All those years, I gave him strength. Now he used my weakness as proof that I didn't matter. It's strange how the mind works. The more you think about betrayal, the more memories come flooding back. Not of the bad, but of the good. The days when love was easy and pure, before it turned into obligation. I remembered the day I gave him his first car, the pride in his eyes, the promise he made that he'd always take care of me someday. Promises like that don't fade. They rot. Slowly. Quietly. As the sun went down that evening, the ache in my chest grew heavier. It wasn't just the cold air still clinging to my body. It was the weight of understanding. I wasn't angry at him anymore. I was angry at myself for giving him too much. I had taught him that love always forgives, no matter what. I never taught him that love also remembers. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was too still. I rolled myself to the porch and stared at the same spot I'd been left in. The air smelled the same. The boards still creaked under my wheels. But I wasn't helpless anymore. I wasn't waiting for someone to save me. I was thinking, clear, sharp thoughts. I realized that I couldn't make him care through words. I'd already said enough over the years. What he respected wasn't family or love. It was power. And I still had some of that left, buried under the years, hidden in the same place he'd never think to look. When I went back inside, I opened my desk drawer. Inside were papers from the old days. Business files, contracts, stock records from the construction company I'd built decades ago. The same company I'd sold before retiring. The same one I'd once helped my son get started with through an investment that's still quietly tied back to my name. I ran my hand over those papers, tracing the printed letters, the faded ink. My son might have forgotten where he came from, but I hadn't. I closed the drawer and smiled for the first time in weeks. The pain was still there, but now it had direction. He thought he'd left me out in the cold, and won. He didn't realize he'd just woken something inside me that didn't freeze easily. A man who built his life from the ground up and knew how to take it back the same way. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The air was cold but clean, the kind of cold that keeps your head sharp. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the old folder again. The papers were yellowed and rough at the edges, but they held power. Ownership records, signed agreements, partial share documents. Back when I sold my construction company years ago, I'd kept a small percentage of ownership, tucked away under a trust in my name. My son never knew. When he started his own company years later, I had helped him through that same connection, introducing him to people who owed me favors. Those same people were still out there, some retired, some still in business. I started writing down names. By the end of the day, I had a short list of people I could call. Men I'd built things with. Men who knew me not as an old man in a wheelchair, but as the boss who paid them on time, kept them safe, and never broke a deal. I made the first call to Texas. An old friend named Frank, the same man who handled my company sale 2 decades ago. He still remembered my voice. I told him I needed information, not sympathy. Within hours, he sent me everything I asked for. Updated registration records, shareholder information, and legal access tied to the small equity I still held. My name was still there, buried under layers of new ownership, but it was there, enough to matter. For 3 days straight, I worked quietly from that kitchen table. While my son came and went, talking loudly on his phone, laughing with friends, acting like nothing ever happened, I built my plan piece by piece. I didn't need confrontation. I needed precision. Every night when he went to bed, I checked my emails, signed papers electronically, made silent moves. My old lawyer, another man who owed me a favor, drafted the transfer forms I needed. The ownership chain was still legal, still active, still binding. All it required was 3 signatures and 1 witness. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. To him, I was still the quiet, weak father sitting in his chair, drinking coffee, watching TV. He had no idea that every time he left for work, I was pulling the rug out from under him. He didn't know that the man who built his first business connections was still the one with the final say. He had treated me like I was invisible, but he forgot one thing. Invisible doesn't mean powerless. By the fourth day, everything was lined up. The documents were ready. Frank had already contacted 2 minor shareholders who still respected my name. They agreed to sell their small percentages to me for pennies on the dollar, just to see me back in charge. The third one, the deciding vote, belonged to a man in Cleveland who'd worked under me years ago. I called him directly. The moment he heard my name, he said, "Sir, I owe you more than one favor." I didn't need to explain much. He signed within the hour. I sat back in my chair, staring at the papers spread across the table. My hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from adrenaline. It had been a long time since I'd felt that old sense of command, the clarity of taking action. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was leading again. The son who left me in the cold had no idea that I was about to warm his life with the same fire he'd forgotten I could still start. That evening, I put everything in a new folder labeled Transfer of Control. I placed it in my desk drawer, right next to the spot where the old wheelchair manual used to sit. There was something poetic about that, replacing the thing that symbolized my dependence with the one that symbolized my authority. I didn't smile, didn't feel satisfaction, just calm. Because this wasn't revenge, it was correction. The kind of correction life gives when you've earned the right to stand again, even if you're sitting down. He thought leaving me outside had ended my strength. He was about to learn that some men don't need legs to stand tall, they just need purpose. And I had found mine again. For the next 7 days, the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. My son walked around with that same false confidence, humming to himself, checking his phone, pacing between the kitchen and the porch like a man who owned the world. He thought the silence meant everything was fine again. He had no clue what was moving behind the scenes. I watched him live his little routine, late nights, fast food bags, calls from people he bragged to about the success of his company. He didn't notice I was spending hours at the table, reading documents, signing forms, or whispering on the phone to men who once built empires with me. He thought I was just an old man passing time, but I was moving faster than he ever had. The paperwork from Texas had already been processed. The bank transfer confirmations were sitting in my inbox. The signatures that gave me controlling interest were complete. My name was now back in the system, the name he used to get loans, contracts, and trust. Every piece of that foundation had always belonged to me. He just built his arrogance on top of it. Each morning, I'd roll out to the porch and drink my coffee while pretending to read the newspaper. He'd drive past me on his way to work, tires crunching over gravel, music blaring from his truck. He never said good morning anymore. But I didn't need words. I already knew that one signature from me could change everything he thought he owned. I looked at him and saw the boy who once said he'd take care of me forever. Now, I was the one taking care of his future, by dismantling the one he built on my name. In those 7 days, I learned more about patience than I had in 70 years. Power doesn't always come from being loud. It comes from being certain. Every night, when the house grew quiet and his laughter faded from the living room, I checked the clock and smiled faintly. I had signed the final transfer on Wednesday. By Monday morning, it would be official. His company, his pride, his entire empire would belong to me. He had built it using my credit line, my old business contacts, my legal foundation. And now, I was simply taking back what was mine. He didn't notice the small changes. The way his phone started ringing less often. The way his accountant stopped replying as fast. The way one of his investors suddenly canceled a meeting. He brushed it off, too arrogant to connect the dots. Meanwhile, I received an email confirming the board had accepted my re-entry as the primary stakeholder. It was done. Silent, clean, and legal. One evening during that week, he threw a small party at the house. A few friends, loud music, laughter echoing down the hallway. I stayed in my room, the door closed, the hum of their laughter muffled behind the walls. I didn't feel anger. I felt distance, the kind that can't be crossed by blood anymore. I knew those laughs wouldn't last long. I knew what Monday morning would bring. And I didn't need to warn him. That Sunday night, he was out late again. I sat in the dark living room, lights off, just the glow of the lamp over the table. I looked at the papers stacked neatly in front of me. Legal confirmations, bank transfers, ownership seals, my signature, printed and final. I ran my hand over the company name, his company's name, and felt nothing but quiet completion. He came home after midnight, stumbling through the door, still laughing from the night out. He didn't see me there, sitting in the corner. For a moment I almost spoke, almost told him what tomorrow would bring. But I stopped myself. He didn't deserve a warning. He needed to feel it the same way I did that night on the porch, sudden, cold, and unforgettable. By the time I went to bed, I had already written one final letter, sealed in an envelope on the counter. Not to apologize, not to explain. Just a reminder. The same name that gave him everything could take it all back just as quietly. The house slept peacefully that night. Only one of us knew it was the last night peace would live there. Monday morning came quiet and sharp, the kind of morning that feels ordinary to everyone except the person who knows the ground is about to move. I woke early, earlier than him, and rolled to the window. His truck was still in the driveway. The sky was gray, heavy with the smell of cold rain. I poured my coffee, set it beside the papers I'd already signed, and waited. The clock ticked toward 8. Somewhere across town, his office was unlocking, his employees settling in, his assistants logging into accounts that no longer recognized his name. At 8:15, the emails went out. Automatic, precise, professional. A full ownership update, effective immediately. The company, its assets, its bank accounts, everything with his name on it was now legally under mine. By the time he left the house that morning, I had already received confirmation from Frank and the Cleveland lawyer. Every transfer had gone through overnight. The last line in the document said it clearly. Majority control transferred to primary shareholder Mr. Peterson. That was me. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like balance. I didn't smile, didn't gloat. I just folded the papers neatly and placed them in my drawer. The world had gone back to how it should have been. I watched from the window as he got in his truck, full of energy, talking loudly on his phone like nothing had changed. He drove off fast, splashing water over the gravel. I knew exactly what would happen next. Around 9, when he tried to enter his office building, his keycard wouldn't work. Security would stop him, confused but polite. His assistant would call the board, only to hear my name. His email would bounce back. His accounts would freeze. And for the first time, he'd understand what it felt like to be locked out of something that once belonged to you. Around noon, my phone buzzed. Frank texted me 2 words. "It's done." That was all I needed. I put the phone down and leaned back in my chair. The silence in the house felt cleaner somehow, lighter. The kind of silence that comes after a long storm finally ends. I thought about how quickly things can turn when people forget who built the ground they stand on. My son had walked over me like a doormat for years, thinking my kindness was weakness. But kindness isn't weakness. It's restraint. And once restraint is gone, all that's left is truth. He didn't come home until late that afternoon. The sound of the truck door slamming told me everything. Anger, panic, disbelief. He burst through the front door, still holding his phone, voice trembling. I didn't move. I stayed by the table, calm. He paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair, shouting things I barely heard. He couldn't understand how it happened, how everything could disappear in one morning. But that's how betrayal works. Sudden for the one who causes it, slow for the one who endures it. He threw his keys on the counter, muttering to himself, checking his phone again like the screen might tell him something different. I didn't speak. There was nothing to explain. He finally stopped pacing, stood there breathing heavy, and looked at me. I met his eyes, not angry, not proud, just steady. He searched for words, but there were none left that mattered. He had taken my dignity that night on the porch. I had simply taken back what he'd built on top of it. By evening, the calls started coming in, from his employees, his investors, his accountant. They all wanted to know what was happening, and every one of them now had to talk to me. I answered each call politely, calmly, without emotion. Yes, the ownership transfer is official. Yes, I'll be taking over operations. No gloating, no satisfaction, just business. The same business I had once built, the same kind of work he thought I'd forgotten how to do. When night fell, he sat on the couch, head in his hands, silent. For once, there was no noise in the house, just the sound of rain tapping softly against the window. I rolled past him without a word, paused for a second by the door, and looked out onto the porch, the same porch where he'd left me that night. The wind blew cold again, but this time I wasn't the one outside. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the rain hitting the roof. He sat on the couch for a long time, staring at the floor, phone still in his hand. Every few minutes, the screen lit up with calls from unknown numbers, probably investors, bankers, or employees trying to make sense of what happened. He didn't answer a single one. I watched him from across the room, not out of spite, but because I wanted to remember this moment, the moment a man finally sees what he's done. His pride had always been louder than reason, but now it had gone quiet. That quiet was heavier than any anger I could have thrown at him. He finally looked up. His face was pale, eyes red, jaw tight. He opened his mouth once or twice, like he wanted to say something, but no words came out. He walked to the counter where the papers sat, the ones I had left there by design. They weren't hidden. I wanted him to see them. He flipped through the pages, his hands shaking. He saw the signatures, the stamps, the letterhead. My name. Each page told the same story. Everything he thought belonged to him was now mine. He dropped the papers onto the counter and turned away. For a second I thought he might walk out, but he didn't. He leaned against the wall, ran a hand through his hair and laughed, not from humor, but disbelief. The sound of it echoed through the house. It wasn't the laugh of a confident man. It was the laugh of someone who finally realized he'd built his castle on another man's foundation. He muttered something to himself, something bitter and tired, then sank into a chair at the table. I rolled toward the window, my back to him, staring at the same porch where I had frozen that night. The wood still carried faint marks from where my wheelchair had been stuck. The rain made the surface glisten, like the cold had returned just to remind me. I turned around slowly and looked at him. He didn't meet my eyes. His breathing was uneven, his shoulders slumped. The room smelled like coffee and wet air, the kind of smell that hangs around after something breaks that can't be fixed. He finally said something under his breath, a few words I couldn't fully hear, but I understood the tone. It wasn't anger anymore. It was confusion. A son who couldn't understand how the man he thought was weak could move mountains so quietly. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I simply rolled closer to the window, reached out, and pointed to the porch. That same spot. That same night. I didn't say a single word, but he knew exactly what I was saying. He stared at that spot for a long time, his jaw tightening again. I could see him replaying it in his head. The cold night, the silence, the laughter, the locked door. The memory hit him, and his face changed. The arrogance faded. The fight drained out of him. He lowered his head into his hands, and for the first time in years, he looked like the boy I once knew. The one who used to hold my hand when crossing the street, who used to cry when he fell off his bike, who used to say he'd always take care of me. The silence stretched. I let it. Sometimes silence teaches louder than words. I rolled back to my desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a single page, a letter transferring him a small monthly stipend, just enough to survive. I placed it on the counter beside him and turned my chair toward the hallway. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. That moment wasn't revenge. It was justice. He had left me out in the cold to suffer. I had left him in the warmth to understand. The difference between us was simple. I had learned to endure pain. He had only ever learned to avoid it. When I reached my room, I closed the door gently behind me. Outside, the rain slowed and the wind softened. I sat there in the dark, not proud, not sad, just done. The storm had passed, but the lesson stayed. The next few weeks showed what real silence can do to a man. His voice, once loud in every room, turned faint. The phone calls stopped coming. The truck that used to roar down the driveway stayed parked, collecting dust. The laughter, the noise, the music, all of it vanished, replaced by the hum of nothing. He stopped leaving the house early. He stopped dressing up. He sat for hours on the porch where I had once frozen, staring at the same road I used to watch, like he was waiting for something to change that never would. Every now and then, I'd see him hold his phone up, checking the balance on an account that no longer existed. The numbers he saw weren't just gone, they were mine now. His house bills started to pile up on the counter. He didn't open most of them. The few he did, he folded and pushed aside. There were calls from the mortgage company, reminders from the bank, letters from creditors, all addressed to him, none of which he could answer. The house that once smelled like coffee and fresh paint started to smell like dust and old air. The pride he used to wear like armor started to crack. I could see it in the way he walked slower, the way he didn't make eye contact anymore. Every step was heavier than the last. He tried to act like he still had control. I'd hear him on the phone sometimes, trying to convince people that things were temporary, that new investors were coming. But everyone in business knows when a name is burned, it stays burned. He had treated people like they owed him. Now, no one returned his calls. The ones who once cheered him on had already moved on to the next rising name. The world is quick to forget men who mistake arrogance for leadership. The day his car got repossessed, he didn't tell me. I only knew because I heard the tow truck outside, the sound of the chain tightening, the metal scraping against the driveway. It was the same sound as that cold porch night, a sound that marked an ending. I stayed inside, watching from the window, calm and steady. He stood there in the rain, hands in his pockets, watching the truck drive away. No shouting, no anger, just stillness. He finally knew what helplessness felt like. After that, he spent more time inside, avoiding the world. His friends stopped visiting. His phone barely rang. He started making smaller meals, cutting corners wherever he could. The pride that once filled the house had deflated. Every corner of that place echoed with the same emptiness I had once felt. Then, one morning, I rolled past his room and noticed the bed was empty. His things were gone. The clothes, the shoes, even the framed photo of him and his mother. All that was left behind was a single envelope on the table. Inside was the small stipend letter I had written for him, folded neatly. On the back, in messy handwriting, he'd written 2 words. I understand. He didn't leave an address. He didn't say where he was going. I heard from a friend months later that he'd been seen at a shelter downtown, working odd jobs, keeping to himself. I didn't feel joy or pity, just quiet acceptance. He had fallen, yes, but not because I pushed him. He fell because he had climbed too high on a ladder made of ego and forgot who built the ground beneath it. The house felt lighter without him. I could move freely, open the windows, breathe. I kept the porch light on at night, not for him, but as a reminder of what happens when love turns into entitlement. That light wasn't for him to find his way back. It was for me, to remember that survival doesn't always mean standing. Sometimes it means sitting still while the ones who hurt you collapse under their own weight. The house is quiet again, the kind of quiet that doesn't hurt anymore. I wake up to the sound of birds outside instead of shouting or slammed doors. The sunlight comes through the window in soft lines, hitting the floor beside my new wheelchair. It's clean, silver, smooth, nothing like the old one that once sat on the porch, rusted from that night. I keep it by the window now, polished every Sunday, not because I need to move fast, but because it reminds me how far I've come without ever standing. The porch light stays on every evening, not for anyone to find their way home, but as a small victory, proof that I decide when the light goes out, not anyone else. Life feels different when peace replaces pride. I spend my mornings watching the trees outside sway with the wind. The same wind that once froze me now feels warm against my face. I cook simple meals, make coffee just the way I like, and listen to the radio without interruptions. I don't look at my phone much anymore. There's no one I'm waiting to hear from. My days are quiet, steady, full of small things that used to go unnoticed when noise filled every corner. Sometimes I still think about him, not with anger, not even with regret, just reflection. I wonder where he sleeps now, whether he still keeps that old photo of his mother close. Maybe he's working somewhere small, rebuilding something piece by piece. Maybe he's still angry. Or maybe, like me, he's learned that the things we build out of ego fall faster than the things we build with respect. The truth is, I don't need to know. I already saw what kind of man he became. I just hope he remembers what kind of man raised him. The neighbors still wave when they pass by. Some stop and talk about their kids, their jobs, their small problems. I listen, smile, offer advice when they ask. None of them know what really happened inside this house. To them, I'm just the quiet old man who keeps his yard clean and his porch light on. I like it that way. People don't need to see the wars you've survived to understand your peace. Every evening, I roll out onto the porch as the sky turns orange. The same boards creak under my wheels, but they sound softer now. I breathe in slow, watching the horizon fade. There's no bitterness left, only calm. I used to think justice meant seeing someone suffer. Now I understand it means living without carrying the weight of what they did. He took my dignity once, but in trying to destroy me, he reminded me who I really was. When the first stars come out, I sit there with my coffee, listening to the crickets. The world feels quiet and fair again. I don't hate him. Hate would mean he still controls something inside me. He doesn't. He's just a chapter I've finished reading. One that taught me how to build boundaries instead of bridges that lead to disappointment. I sometimes see his old truck drive by on the highway in my dreams, not in front of my house, but far in the distance. It never stops. It just passes, heading somewhere I'll never need to go. I wake up after those dreams feeling lighter. Not because I've forgotten, but because I've learned to remember without pain. This is the peace that comes after losing everything and realizing you still have yourself. This is what it means to win quietly. He took my wheelchair that night and left me outside, thinking I was too weak to matter. He thought cold air and time would break me. But all it did was wake me up. I didn't yell, didn't curse, didn't chase him. I learned something stronger than anger, patience, and patience gave me power. The same hands that once pushed him on swings signed the papers that pushed him out of his own company. The same porch where I froze became the place I found clarity. That night could have been my end, but instead, it became my beginning. He forgot that I wasn't just an old man in a chair. I was the man who built the ground he stood on. Now I sit in my warm house, watching the lights flicker across the street, and I realize something simple. Some people only learn when they lose everything they took for granted. He lost money, friends, a company, and comfort. But I hope, somewhere out there, he found humility. I didn't take his life away. I gave him a mirror. Everything he became, he built on my kindness. Everything he lost, he buried under his pride. I didn't ruin him. I reminded him. I don't expect an apology. The world doesn't work on apologies. It works on lessons. And this one, he'll never forget. He'll remember the night the power shifted, the day his keycard stopped working, the moment he stood on the same porch where I once sat, feeling the same helplessness I endured. That's the kind of justice no court can order. Sometimes I wonder if he ever drives by this house again, late at night, just to see if the porch light's still on. Maybe he does. Maybe he looks through the window and sees me sitting here, alive, calm, unmoved. Maybe he thinks about knocking, but stops himself, because deep down, he knows that door doesn't open the same way anymore. I didn't win because I took his company. I won because I took back my peace, the kind of peace that doesn't come from revenge, but from truth. I learned that love without respect is just control in disguise. And I learned that no matter how old you are, it's never too late to stand up, even if it's from a chair. He left me outside one cold Ohio night, thinking I'd freeze in silence. But now, he's the one left in the cold, alone, quiet, searching for warmth that doesn't exist anymore. Life has a way of circling back. You don't always need to chase it. Sometimes, all you have to do is wait. In the end, He taught me something too. Mercy isn't weakness. It's power held back. And the strongest thing I ever did was not destroy him, but let him destroy himself. He left me in the cold with no chair and no care. I left him in the world he built, one without mercy. He lost everything money could buy and learned the value of what love once gave. In America, karma doesn't need a courtroom. Sometimes it signs papers. Sometimes it just sits quietly on the porch, waiting for perfect time.